Hello everyone, I'm Patrick Hubbard, Head Geek at SolarWinds, with today's presentation, Port 1777, Introduction to the SolarWinds API. When we first started planning THWAC Camp, I got really excited this year because I wanted to do this last year, I didn't have a chance, and the API has come such a long way, and so many of you have had so many questions that I think you're really going to get a kick out of this. I certainly have too. Just kind of a quick overview here of our API. We'll do an invoke here. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to give you a brief history of the Orion platform so you sort of understand how all of this came to be. I'm going to introduce you to SWIS, that's the SolarWinds Information Service. We'll talk about how to get started using the API. I'm going to give you an introduction to SWQL, which is the SolarWinds query language, and then we'll talk about how you can not only read data, but also create, update, and delete it using CRUD actions that are also available using SWIS. So before we begin, just a little workplace safety reminder. The API provides an amazing amount of power. So you can do things like automate manual processes right now that may take you all day and knock off and go home early, which would be great. You could also blow up your Orion install and delete all of your data, which would not be awesome. So just a couple of recommendations as you start to work with this. Do set up a dev instance of Orion for your experimentation. Do not try untested PowerShell scripts that you download off of the internet on your production systems. Do make a backup of your Orion database. Don't make your first project something that's doing node creates inside of loops. That probably would not be a good thing. Do dream really big. Many of you have got some great ideas for automation projects, and this is a chance to really take a crack at that and see how to really make your Orion do some pretty cool things. And just get in there and have some fun. And the last thing, of course, give us plenty of feedback and participate on the THWAC forum. Okay, so let's start with a brief history of the Orion platform. And I like to really take a second anytime I talk about Orion and NPM and now SAM and so many of the other modules, because it's easy for me as an old-timer to sort of speak about Orion and NPM interchangeably. But in this case, we really are talking about a set of core services that underlie all of these different applications and modules. So we're talking about Orion. And in the beginning, NPM begat Orion. And for those of you who've been with the company for a really, really long time as customers, NPM started as one of the Win GUIs inside the engineer's toolset about a decade ago. And customers said, hey, this is great. We love the alerting, reporting, and charts and graphs, but it would be nice if it ran on something more than my laptop. And they wanted it to run on a server 24/7. So the first version of that server-based version of NPM was called Orion, and it was a Visual Basic website bolted directly to a SQL server. But after several thousand customers, and those customers started to get bigger and bigger, and there were a lot of modules added, it was time for a rewrite. And so the core services were actually broken out as the Orion platform, and then NPM became just another module sitting on top of those common services. And that's things like alerting and reporting, and charting, and graphs, and mapping, and a bunch of other features. The other thing that happened was that Orion truly became in tier. So instead of being bolted directly on top of the SQL server, everything from web, the polling and reporting, and then even the coordination components between different elements all started to communicate using service layers. And those started working over port 17777. And I used that port number because you might have occasionally seen that in an error message, which basically just tells you that the information service isn't running. Or maybe it's blocked. Maybe there's an ACL that's preventing access and you have a remote website. But anyway, so those started running on port 1777. The main thing that happened was this allowed tremendous scalability and improvements in performance and flexibility for larger and larger customers. And then after a couple of years ago, we started making the API available and then actually started producing a full SDK, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So the main thing here to keep in mind is that what I'm going to be showing you and what this API is about is not a special little add-on to make it easy for customers to access data. These are actually the guts of how Orion is communicating internally. So it's the same sort of industrial level, heavily maintained core technology that you would expect instead of just a little add-on SDK that maybe somebody maintains. So to start off, let's talk about SWIS. That's the SolarWinds Information Service. It is not cheese. It is not a country. It's the data access layer used by SolarWinds products to communicate. It's a hybrid of object-oriented and relational features. It supports a SQL-like language that we'll talk about a little bit later called SWQL. But the main thing is that it allows cross-boundary, whether it's internal applications on the same server, cross-protocol, but even cross-operating system integration. The other thing that you probably never thought about is that you are dealing with a SWIS login all the time. Every time you open up Network Atlas and it asks for the server name and your Orion logon information, that is actually a SWIS login page. And then what's really cool in the latest release is that now it actually supports a REST and JSON interface, and I'm actually going to do a demo of that for you here in just a second. The main benefits for using SWIS to do your integration is, first of all, it already provides a credential provider. So it's using an Orion account that's already inside of Orion, so you don't have to create your own security layer on top of that. That also means that you get Orion account limitation features built in out of the box. So if you want to have differentiated views for different end users, you don't have to create a separate service for each one with a different set of limitations. You can provide a common service and then just limit what those accounts are able to see, and the results that come back will automatically be limited based on those account limitations. The best thing, from my opinion, and I once upon a time built all of our demo systems and have abused Orion databases in ways that I don't think you guys can even begin to imagine, is that you don't have to worry about the database schema anymore. Because you're dealing with the objects and an object.notation reference language, we can make changes on the back end that will not break your applications, that will not break your integrations, because you're not dealing with the database schema anymore. It also makes it way easier to figure out how things work. And then the other cool thing about it is it's meta, and that the SWIS tools and APIs allow you to query information about objects, not just their data. So as you explore them and extend the capabilities of your integrations, you can actually quickly figure out how things work. So where is SWIS? I mean, if you look at your Orion install, you'll see lots and lots of different services, everything from JMX bridges to the job scheduler and data collectors. But the ones to look at are the information services and the Orion module engine. And SWIS is actually being provided by just those services. It listens on 2 ports, and it provides identical operations on both. The first one you already know, that's 1777, and that's a .NET TCP based. It's really high performance, but it's Microsoft only. So then the second port that you may not have seen is port 17778, and that is actually a WSI SOAP port over HTTPS, and that allows for interoperability with other programming languages. And if you want, take your favorite WSDL Explorer and check out these URLs right here. You can actually pull the WSDLs down from both of those, although in a minute you're going to see the documentation that you really don't need to. But it allows you to explore those directly and doesn't expect you to have to know everything about them to start experimenting with the data. Okay, so the first thing to do is you're going to need to get the SDK. So let's talk about how to get started with that. If you happen to know this URL up here to get directly to the thread, you can use that. So for me, the easiest way to do it is I just Google SolarWinds SDK and then click on the first link that comes up. And that'll take you right here to the SDK information thread. Now there are a lot of other threads, and this is actually in the SolarWinds Labs section of THWAC under the Orion SDK group. But right here across the top, you can actually see all the past and current versions. The current version is 1.7, and just click right here to download it. I'm going to be using that one for this presentation. And then, of course, the forum is right there in the lab space, and it's monitored by a number of folks inside the company. So definitely get in there and give us your feedback on how it's working for you. So the thing to do there is to download the zip file. That zip file is going to include an MSI file, which means you're going to need Windows to unpack it, but there's a reason for that, because it's going to install a Windows-based tool, which is the SWIS GUI Studio, and I'm going to actually give you a demo of that. But it's also going to unpack all the other elements of the SDK, and so you don't need Windows to integrate with Orion. So if you're using Python, you can just copy all of those source files and the examples off onto a Linux box and really start having some fun. But you do have to at least unpack it onto a Windows machine. It's also kind of handy because then if you put it on the Orion server itself, then you might be able to do some quick PowerShell examples and the rest of it to make sure everything's working well. And then I definitely recommend that you read the SDK applicability PDF first. It's only 3 pages long, and it can really give you a great sense of how to get started. And I'll talk about it later again, but the documentation that's included with the SDK is just really, really good. So now you've got your MSI unpacked on the machine. What's in the SDK? Well, the first thing that you're going to get is SWQL Studio. So that's the Object Explorer, it's the query test environment, and it actually will connect like anything else using SWIS, using your Orion account. And it allows you to visualize the object model and inheritance. And there's a bunch of tools. I'll show you how that works. And it'll let you actually also test your view limitations as well, because you can log in under different account context. There's also a number of high-level clients that are already built for you. There's a snap-in for PowerShell, and there's one for Python. And then there's sample code for everything from C# to Java, Perl, PowerShell, and VB. The other thing that's really cool is you get complete schema documentation in the HTML format. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about here is SWQL. That's the SolarWinds query language, and it's a lot like SQL, but I think it's better. First of all, it's based on a read-only subset of SQL, which can keep you out of a lot of trouble. But it supports a lot of powerful constructs from SQL. So select, including from and where and grouping and having. You can do ordering. You can do joins with differentiators for the type of joins. You can do top-in, distincts. You can do subqueries, and you can do that also from and inside of joins. It also supports a lot of aggregate functions like sum and max, min, average, and count, so that if you're doing reporting, you can do rollups. Supports regular functions to make sure that it keeps you out of trouble with null values. Worry about things like basic rounding, that sort of thing. It does not support select star from, and I'm going to get into that in a minute because there's an included sort of auto magic inheritance as a part of SWQL. So it doesn't support star. You do need to explicitly name the fields that you're looking for. And it doesn't support update, insert, and delete. But we do support CRUD actions for all of those as well. It certainly doesn't support drop. The other cool thing about SWQL is that it has features that really aren't a part of SQL. The first one of those is navigation properties. So they're, like I mentioned, they're sort of an automagic join for related objects. So for example, if you're doing a query on interfaces, then interfaces are always attached to a node. So with a dot notation, you can go from the interface out to node and then to a property on node like caption without doing a join. Now, if you want to do a join for a particular reason, and I'll actually show you an example of that in a minute, you can certainly do that, but it makes navigating that an awful lot easier. The other thing that it does is it lets you do row windows really, really easily. So especially if you have 10,000 nodes, you probably are not going to want to return all 10,000 at once. It makes it easy to cut and slice those up into chunks that you can work with, and it goes right after the order by clause. So it's familiar like SQL, and you get this intuitive object dot notation. And the other thing is that it's read-only, so you can't really break anything with it. So it's a great way to start working with SWIS. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the SWQL Studio here. And it's asking me for a logon. So it's going to ask me for a server name, the type of server that it's connecting to. So that's going to be the API that it's going to use in this case. And then a password. And guess what? I stuck with admin blank on this one. It's going to give me a connection. And now I can start exploring the objects on that server. You can see here this one's got APM installed and a couple of other modules. And so as I scroll down here, you can actually see all of the different objects that are available to you in that install. Now, this list may be different depending on what's installed and things like your custom properties and that sort of thing you've created. But for example, I can just go in here and start exploring, right? So here's my Orion.nodes object, and then here's all the properties of Orion nodes. But beyond that, I can actually also get my linked properties, and then the associated ones as well. Now, I know this seems like it could actually get to be pretty complex. There is a entity inheritance graph included, which is really great. So as you're learning about this, you can use this as a tool to kind of scroll through here and figure out how things are associated with other objects. But I like to just get started. So let's say we're going to look at our Orion nodes list here. If I right-click on this, it'll say generate a select statement, and it's going to actually go out here and generate a SWQL select statement, an awful lot like what you'd get in the SQL Manager. But I could also, if I wanted to, create the select statement with all the inherited properties as well. So it'll actually show you how to do that as well. And then I'm just going to execute that. And now it's gone out onto the server and pulled all of the data that I asked for with that SWQL command. I mean, that's pretty cool, and it's really, really powerful. I can run this again. I'll just cut a whole bunch of these properties out here, and we'll just re-execute that to prove that it, in fact, is executing only what I'm asking for. And here you can see I came back with a subset of that data. So the SWQL Studio is a great way to get started. The other thing that it'll let you do is it'll let you set parameters for parameterized query testing. I'm not going to go into that because this is not actually a programming guide, but it's definitely a part of the admin guide, which you should take a look at. But that'll allow you to test parameterized queries as well. So that is SWQL Studio. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in terms of a basic select like this, but I also mentioned that these were available using a JSON REST API as well. So let me show you what that looks like. So over here, I've got my Orion set up, and I've got a bunch of nodes on this system, and one of them, I'm going to pick on just a little bit here, this EnergyWise switch. Sitting out here, I can see all of its details, and if I wanted to interact with this thing using REST, there's a bunch of ways that I can do that. But the easiest way is that the service is provided through a couple of different URLs, and again, this is all in the main admin guide, but essentially I'm going to give it the URL to that service, which is running in this case on port 17778. Remember, that's your interoperability port. And then I'm providing a query. So in this case, I'm going to ask it for all of my puller information with a particular ID, and I'm going to limit it to 3 rows. I'm going to grab that. Now, if I was integrating this, I probably would either be using PowerShell or I'd write a custom application or something else. But I'm going to just use the web browser here natively. We'll get that data. And it comes back with my results here. So these are the pullers that I have running on this system, and I've reinstalled it a couple of times. So I've created 3 different puller IDs. But that SWQL is running directly off of that information service API. So again, there's a number of different ways that you can do that. This was a quick way that I did it for this example. Another way that you might do it, this one I've got, I think you might have noticed down here, I've got a number of nodes on this system. If I wanted to list all the nodes, that might actually take a really long time. So this one just going to give me the first 20 nodes. So if we look at this query, I'm going to ask it for the caption, IP address, node description, the vendor, but I'm also asking it for this value here, a custom property called boss OK, and if you watched the last lab episode, you'll remember what that one's from Orion nodes, and then I'm doing a join out to the nodes custom properties. And then I basically can attach that. I give it the equality for that join, and then I'm also doing an order by, and I'm limiting the number of rows that I get back. So in this case, I'll paste that same thing right in here. And now I have the top 20 nodes that came from that server. So I can actually see the node caption, description if there was one, the vendor, and a little bit of other information about it. So again, that was a really quick way to get data using SWQL, and I didn't have to do any other integration. It was just available for me right there. So if you think about how handy that would be if you need to provide Orion data to an external team, you basically just give them a URL and the basic SWQL that they would execute. You use view limitations on the account that you provided them, and then maybe put that account into a limitation group that's associated with Active Directory. And if for whatever reason that person outside of your organization is taken out of your company, they're going to close their Active Directory account, and they're also going to be blocked from the integration using the API. So really great integration security using SWIS. Okay, so what if you want more? What if you want to actually do creates and updates and deletes on objects? Well, SWIS now supports CRUD actions, which is really, really powerful. Have you wanted to do things like add nodes or add interfaces on nodes? The SWIS automatically supports the CRUD actions to make that easy. Now, the forerunner to CRUD before version 2.5 was something called invoke, and it's still supported. And it was basically a library of verbs that could be called on Orion objects. So, for example, if you wanted to do an acknowledge on an alert status, or you wanted to unmanage or remanage a node, you could do all of those with the invoke structure. And it's still in there, and it does some things that are really pretty powerful as well, like discovery and a couple of other things, where you really want to let the platform do the heavy lifting for you. But you guys said you wanted more, and so with 2.5 now, we support CRUD for almost all the objects in the systems. It's limited pretty much only by your imagination. And you use a set of URIs to address your entities. And so that basically, again, would be the basic host and endpoint. And then the entity type, basic filter information, and then optional key filters for objects. So for example, you'd have Orion nodes, the node ID, now then the interfaces on that ID, and then an interface filter for interface 2 would be interface 2 on node 1. Then when you call an action, that action is going to be applied to that one specific object. So you get all the power you need to shoot yourself in the foot, but remember, you asked for it. So let's do a quick demo of how that works. Now, I had this node up here a minute ago. This is that EnergyWise switch, right? So I added a custom property down here called boss OK. And I had a view for a manager that literally had, in another video, that just had one green button for the things that he could see. But we allowed him to see a few other things with this custom property. But let's say I want to update this custom property using a CRUD action. So the way that I'm going to do that in this case is actually with PowerShell. So let's take a look at that script. So this is a sample script on how to do this using an update property on a node, and this in fact is coming directly from the SDK. I've modified it slightly to make it a little bit easier to do what I want to do specifically here, but it's a great way to get started. Now the point that I want to make about this is that this thing is only 24 lines long, and really if you wanted to just hard create the URI that you were calling using something other than PowerShell, and you didn't want to have parameters that automatically built the string for you and everything else, if you just wanted to build that through your own mechanism and execute it, this would be one line long. Now the other thing that's happening here is, as I mentioned, there are some precompiled tools for this, high-level tools, and so one of those is the PowerShell snap-in for SWIS, which has already been applied here to my PowerShell. And again, instructions for setting that up, it's a couple of steps, and it's also in the admin guide. So what's basically going to happen here is I'm going to create a URI for this custom property, and then I'm going to pass the property that I want to apply to that. And in this case, the snap-in is smart enough to figure out how to do that for me because it operates at a pretty high level. So what I'm going to do is node ID 672, which I happen to know is the node ID of this node up here. I can also see it right up here. So node 672. This is my server endpoint and my logon information. Password is blank in this case, and I'm just going to set the parameter boss OK equal to true, and then that's going to build a URI for me, and then it's going to call the set Swiss object method, and then pass in everything that it needs to execute that. So let's go back over here to PowerShell, and I showed you the one that said true, but we're going to set it to false because right now that value is true. So let's come over here to PowerShell. We're going to execute false. I'm going to refresh my view. And you can see that boss OK custom value is now set to false. I could also see that through the REST API if I wanted to. Got a little code here that's actually going to add the limitation for select all of the values where the boss property is set to true. Grab that. I'm going to throw that into my web browser. So here's all of the nodes where the boss OK value is true, and you'll notice that the that energy-wise switch is not here. This is the 4506 is. So if we want to add that guy back in there, well, let's run the other PowerShell script that sets that to true. I'm going to refresh. And look at that. There's my energy-wise 3560, and we can also see that in the web interface. 3560, and we can also see that right here in the details. Boss OK equal to true. So that's just a really simple example of how you can actually use CRUD actions to not only read data using the SWIS API, but actually do create updates and deletes as well. So again, just a quick summary there. The actions, again, are based on object URIs. They're really easy to look up, and they're in the documentation. Definitely check that out. You can only specify a single entity per URI. So if you need to make a bulk update, you'll first want to do a select, get a list of objects, and then iterate over the results to make all of those changes. Definitely use verb for high-level functions. Things like interfaces, discover interfaces on node are built in there for you, so you can let the platform do the heavy lifting. And then the last thing is definitely RTSM, read the SDK manual. It's only 40 pages, including the examples, and there's lots of code that you can skip that doesn't apply to you, and I'm not picking on you, Visual Basic. But what's really great is this was written by the team that actually wrote the code. So it is really dense and to the point. So they've all been tested, and it's regularly updated along with each release that's using the internal SDK. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead and download this today and get in there and check it out. This is especially applicable to you if you have already hacked the Orion SQL database directly, because this is so much easier to use. And the other thing is that it really does include secret sauce that you just don't have access to reverse engineer. For example, using the API to do interface discovery on a node is actually calling the same code that gets called through the GUI or through discovery. So that's something that you wouldn't be able to do. So you're not only having access to the data, but you actually have access to call functions on the platform itself. Do remember that it's not a supported product feature, so you can't call support to get help with it. It does, however, have a very active SWAC group. And remember, this is not a hack. I mean, this is direct access to the same production plumbing that Orion and its product family uses itself to interact between layers, modules, and even external applications. It's very well documented, and it's actively developed with each release. I mean, it's from the gurus that build the Orion platform. They've been with this product for years, and the level of streamlining and functionality that's available in the SDK is extremely mature for something that's really only been exposed to customers for a little bit over a year now. And the last thing is, like so many SolarWinds products and tools, it's completely free. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead and download it right now. While I'm speaking, go ahead and Google SolarWinds SDK. Start the download now, install it on your system, and check it out. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the SWAC forums and to see all of the creative hacks that you all come up with using the SDK. So again, I'm Patrick Hubbard, and thanks for attending today's presentation.